The leak of a draft Supreme Court opinion.
The Supreme Court.
The court that dark money built.
Breaking news at the Supreme Court.
The landmark Roe v. Wade case.
A woman's constitutional right to an abortion.
My body, my choice.
And Leonard Leo, who really is responsible for helping Trump fill the Supreme Court.
A Supreme Court decision with dramatic consequences. The justices ruling 5-4.
You look at the decisions like Shelby County that attacked voting rights, and then you look at the dark money cases like Citizens United. It's not just Dobbs.
The court is not in order. This is Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, and welcome to Making the Case. On this podcast, I will be joined by somebody I admire a lot, who kind of used to be my boss, Eric Holder, who was Attorney General of the United States, the third longest serving United States Attorney General in history, and I think served as Deputy Attorney General when I served as United States Attorney for Rhode Island, what put him kind of into being my boss. Eric, welcome. I'm delighted that you have joined us.
Well, thanks so much for having me. But Senator Whitehouse, I can honestly say I never, ever thought that I was your boss. And I would bet that you never thought I was your boss.
Well, we had a great relationship, and I'm really grateful to you. And then, of course, your time serving as Attorney General, I thought, was pretty outstanding. And, of course, your time serving as Attorney General brought you in front of the Senate for oversight hearings. And we have just had the first Senate oversight hearing of America's first MAGA Attorney General, and from somebody who's been there, been in that seat, prepared for questions, felt the duties of answering questions, operated in a highly partisan environment, all of that. What was your takeaway from the parts that you've seen of that, I guess you could call it that ordeal?
Yeah, I thought the performance by the Attorney General Bondi, was breathtaking. The number of important questions that she did not answer, the way in which she did the attacks on people who were asking, and only Democratic senators who were asking very legitimate questions. You could see when she was testifying, she would look down. If you were testifying, she'd look down and look for a piece of paper, I guess, that they had done, for lack of a better term, like opposition research or something, and then try to use that to somehow deflect from answering the questions. But she didn't answer important stuff, like, things you raised. I mean, what happened to the $50,000 that went in a Kava bag to Tom Homan? What about the Epstein files? I mean, there's a whole range of things. I mean, did you talk to the president before the Comey indictment? There's a whole range of things that she simply didn't answer. It comes down to this. If she answered those questions truthfully, she would have made angry the person who she's most concerned about, that is President Trump. If she did something that was not totally accurate, I think she's concerned about committing perjury. So she took the third option, which was to say nothing.
Yeah, it was kind of impressive. I don't think when you were preparing for oversight hearings, you asked your staff to prepare opposition research files on the Republican senators. Is that a fair view of what took place in your prep?
Yeah, that would be fair. That is not something that we ever did. Now, I understand, she's got a lot of questions from a lot of different people. And so you'd have books in front of you with material relevant to, particular subjects.
Yeah.
I mean, I get that.
Yeah.
But opposition research on senators asking me questions, I've never heard anything like that.
No. And her little cliff notes, because she couldn't remember her lines. So she had to revert to her Oppo research cliff notes, and did that so messily that photographers were able to take pictures of her opposition research cliff notes. And then the thing that struck me, particularly because she said it about me, was that when I asked a question about the photo that has been reported that Jeff Epstein showed to an individual who reported having seen it, of Trump with half-naked young ladies that he had in his safe. And I asked her, well, was that in the safe? Did the FBI ever find it? Like, first of all, super easy answer. No, Senator.
Yeah.
And the fact that she couldn't say no is a pretty big tell. But then she went on this thing about how I had taken campaign contributions from a close confidant of Jeffrey Epstein, and she mentioned a name of this person. So easy for my staff to go to my FEC reports and say, did Sheldon actually get any money from this guy? Turned out the answer was no. So in addition to doing Oppo research and not being able to remember her lines long enough so that she had to have her Cliff Notes in front of her, she actually had bad Oppo research. I mean, when you were Attorney General, I suspect you took pretty significant importance in your comments being truthful, and that you had people who were scrupulously fact-checking things that you would say because the Attorney General is held to such a high standard. How does that, like AG telling the truth and the office needing to fact-check your stuff to make sure you always are telling the truth, what was that like as Attorney General?
Yeah, I mean, in anticipation of an oversight hearing, either in the House or in the Senate, you go through, some number of days where you're just preparing for it. And you get these big binders filled with information that you think you're going to be asked about. You actually go through mock hearings where somebody plays you, somebody plays Senator Kennedy from Louisiana, probably fool around and do it with a Southern accent. And try to figure out what is it that they're going to ask you, so that you are prepared to share, relevant information, but relevant, accurate information. I mean, that's always the thing. The preparation of that material was gone over by at least a couple of levels within the Justice Department to ensure that the material I got was, in fact, accurate.
If you inadvertently made a misstatement, somebody would call back and clean it up and say, the Attorney General, said this, we just want to clarify that was an error. What he meant to say was this. We dropped a zero in the whatever it was. But
right.
Facts
and you'd actually
matter.
try to do it. You'd actually try to do it in real time. You'd have somebody behind me who would slip me a piece of paper and say, "Hey, it's 10,000. It's not 100,000."
Yeah, getting it right mattered to every previous Attorney General. So since you've been Attorney General, you have focused a lot on voting rights and the Voting Rights Act. On gerrymandering as a way to influence improperly the voting rights of citizens. We are now seeing in real time President Trump's political henchmen pushing the governor of Texas to redistrict, even though it's not a 10-year redistricting moment, in order to create more Republican seats. What are you seeing going on down there? And tell the viewers, just for starters, what gerrymandering is.
Well, gerrymandering is when one party draws lines for legislative lines for the state legislature or for congressional seats, draw them in such a way that you guarantee a result, that you guarantee that your party is more than likely going to win that seat, no matter how good the candidate is on the other side, no matter what the issues are. And you do that by packing the opposition into one district so that you can make sure that you are dominant in other districts, or what we call was cracking, that is disperse voters by the lines that you draw so that they are weak in all of the resultant districts. And what we're seeing now is, President Trump calling the Republicans in Texas and saying, hey, give me 5 additional seats. In contrast, when he called the folks in Georgia and said, find me 11,780 votes, the Republicans in Georgia said, no, we're not going to do that. In Texas, the Republicans said, no problem. And so this is another attack on our democracy by this administration, whether it's going after Jimmy Kimmel and First Amendment rights, going after universities, going after corporations when it comes to antitrust matters. They're eroding our democracy. And one of the main reasons they're doing it is through this gerrymandering. I mean, they're afraid of the record that they have, don't think that they can hold on to the House, given all the negative things that they have done. And so they're trying to cheat by putting their thumb on the scale.
Do you have a read on how this is playing in Texas? I think in Texas they're seeing homeowners insurance go through the roof, electric utility bills go through the roof, grocery prices go through the roof. They're about to get clobbered by the Republican effort to double people's premiums when they're taking away affordable care credits, adding huge health care costs. So is there any sense down there that regular voters are thinking that this political expedition to try to cheat in elections signals that they're not paying attention to voters' real and immediate concerns, and that there might be some consequence for ignoring the real and immediate concerns in order to try to cheat on the election counts?
Well, you can gauge where the people are based on the polling that you've seen in a bunch of states where they've tried this, and the people are overwhelmingly against it. People in Texas had the ability to come to these hearings about these public hearings about whether or not they supported this gerrymandering, and they overwhelmingly were against it. Editorial boards in Texas were against it. And I think you got to ask yourself, what are members of the House of Representatives or senatorial candidates next year, Republicans, what are they going to run on? I mean, all that litany of things that you just went through is exactly right. Higher costs, the kinds of things that we see ICE doing that I think offend the American people. The American people are for the notion of taking out of our country people who are here illegally and who are committing crimes. But going after waiters, waitresses, day laborers who have been here for extended periods of time and have done nothing wrong, and treating them in such a harsh manner, all of this stuff, I think, is going to make it a very difficult environment for Republicans. And I think the American people are smart enough to see which party is standing for them and which party is doing a whole range of things, particularly with regard to health care, reducing the amount of money that they can have in terms of these subsidies, cutting Medicaid, Medicare is going to be impacted as well, all to get tax breaks to billionaires.
The related issue is, of course, access to the ballot, which the Voting Rights Act defends. There's a case coming up before the Supreme Court this month. There could be one more arrow shot by Chief Justice Roberts into the Voting Rights Act, Louisiana versus Calais. Are you looking at that case? Tell the listeners what this is about.
Yeah, this is just another continuation of the Roberts Court attempt, again, to erode our democracy, going all the way back. You look at Citizens United, unlimited cash, that has had a negative impact on our democracy. The Shelby County case that eviscerated the Voting Rights Act. The Rucho case, which said that partisan gerrymandering cases can't be brought in federal court, and really kind of made real the problems that we're having now with regard to partisan gerrymandering. And now in the Calais case, they want to go after Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which focuses on the protection of people of color and making sure that their political power is not diluted. In places where you have a history of racially polarized voting, Section 2 says you've got to take measures to make sure that African Americans, say in Louisiana or Alabama, have the ability to fully use their political power. Hispanics in Texas. And the court is looking at whether or not that bill passed in 1965, or the section of that bill passed in 1965, is in fact constitutional. And the arguments against its constitutionality are the same ones that were raised back in 1965 and have been rejected by a whole range of courts up until now. And so we'll see what this 6-3 conservative Supreme Court will do with Section 2.
You mentioned Shelby County, which was an interesting decision because it was based off a factual premise. The factual premise being the determination by the 5-4 majority of the Supreme Court that decided it that a new era had arisen, that the concerns of racial voter suppression that had justified the Voting Rights Act were simply no longer true. There was no record of that in the cases below that came up to the Supreme Court. The Voting Rights Act had just been renewed, and there was enormous bipartisan congressional support for the proposition that, in fact, there still were real challenges, real forms of deliberate voter suppression. And yet the court, the 5 of them, went into private deliberations and just made up that fact with no basis at all. You've been a judge. Aren't district judges fact finders? Right. The adversary process supposed to decide what the facts are and not private deliberations that are passed any kind of review or correction of 5 old folks in a room in the back of the Supreme Court somewhere?
Oh, absolutely right. I mean, and I go back even a step further. Congress held hearings, took testimony from scores of people, hundreds of thousands of pages of documents and testimony, fact-finding done by Congress. As you said, overwhelming support for the reauthorization.
Which, by the way, is our job. Congress is supposed to be a fact finder. It's our constitutional duty.
Right. Congress essentially said there is still a reason to have the Voting Rights Act, and therefore we're going to reauthorize it. It was signed by a Republican president, the reauthorization. And the Supreme Court, or 5 members of the Supreme Court, engaged in their own fact-finding. And Chief Justice Roberts famously said that, quote, America has changed, unquote. And, that's true. America, in fact, has changed. But America's not yet at the place where it needs to be with regard to its founding ideals and the way in which all citizens are treated with regard to access to the ballot and being full participants in our democracy. The need for a Voting Rights Act, Section 5, Section 2, Section 4 is still there.
This false fact-finding is a real burr under my saddle. You mentioned Rucho also. They said in that case that these decisions about evaluating partisan crooked gerrymandering were not justiciable, meaning that courts couldn't figure it out. In fact, over and over again, courts had these cases and figured it out and rendered decisions. So it seemed to me that the courts can't handle this stuff was also factually false. And then the whopper was Citizens United, and it's finding that all the new money that flooded into politics, thanks to these 5 judges, was going to be transparent, that everybody would know exactly where the money had come from, that there'd be no doubt, and citizens could attribute a message to the funder in real life. And of course, we've had $8 billion in dark money spent in our elections, every one of which is a factual rebuke to that false proposition. It really seems to me that we've got to make a more concerted attack on the false facts that this Gang of 5 used repeatedly to degrade American democracy in favor of special interests and against ordinary voters.
Oh, I think that's absolutely right. The right is always talking about railing against activist judges. And in the cases that we're talking about, you are seeing the exercise, I think, the improper exercise of raw judicial power. They're wrong when they come with regard to the facts that they find. I mean, they're inconsistent with the facts. And then these predictions that they make about what the impact of these inappropriate factual findings are, their predictions don't turn out to be right. Based on what it is that you said and the way it's turned out, do you still think that America has changed? Do you still think that saying that the courts can't handle gerrymandering cases when district courts, courts of appeals, courts at the state level all have dealt with these cases? The only court that had a problem dealing with gerrymandering cases was the United States Supreme Court. And what does that tell you about about that court?
I'll send you a copy of a brief that I just filed so you can see my response to them on the false fact-finding about the unlimited Citizens United money being transparent and what that has actually meant here, because it's pretty grim. So weaponized is a word we've heard a lot. The excuse that Republicans came up with when their dear leader kept getting convicted of stuff and indicted for stuff was that all of that was unfair, and that represented the Justice Department being weaponized against him. You probably had that word used about you while you were Attorney General. I don't know if you predated that latest piece of political terminology. But in terms of weaponization, have you ever seen anything like what's going on at the Department of Justice right now? You used to run this department. What's your reaction to what you're seeing?
I mean, it's breathtaking. It's unbelievable. It is unprecedented, and it's heartbreaking. I mean, I served as the leader of the Justice Department, but I also started my career as a line lawyer in the public integrity section of the Justice Department, served under Republican as well as Democratic attorneys general, was respected by those people. Didn't always agree. They didn't always agree with policy determinations or recommendations that we made, but that was fine. And to see what they are doing with regard to the removal of career people because of their involvement, legitimate involvement in particular cases that they undoubtedly were assigned to. The weaponization of the Justice Department by bringing cases like the perjury case against former FBI Director Jim Comey. I mean, here's a guarantee: Jim Comey's not going to be convicted. And the only question is, when does this case get kicked? Does it get kicked pre-trial? Does it get kicked at the conclusion of the presentation of the government's evidence, or does a jury ultimately say that Jim Comey is not guilty? I mean, this is clearly something that this Attorney General, at the direction of this president, made a determination that they wanted to go after somebody who they perceived to be an enemy of this president. And that gets to that which distinguishes us from authoritarian regimes. You don't weaponize the Justice Department as they have, or the Ministry of Justice. And that is, in some ways, the clearest example of what this administration is all about and the danger that they pose to our democracy.
Yeah, I'm no big fan of Jim Comey because of some of the stunts that he pulled, but a phony, trumped-up prosecution is still a phony, trumped-up prosecution, and manipulation of the Department of Justice to reach a certain result is still manipulation of the Department of Justice. And I've got to think that there are some real opportunities for Comey's lawyers to dig into the background of all of this, to do some discovery, to flesh out the question of vindictive prosecution, to sort out exactly the procedures and the communications and the emails. So I have to say, I think for Comey's own sake, he'd probably like to see this end soon, but I'd kind of like to see this dwell a bit and see some really significant discovery get rooted out by Comey's lawyers, who are pretty talented prosecutors, and they also know how the Department of Justice works. So they'll know what the right questions are to ask, and they'll know what the tells are when somebody cheated on internal departmental procedures, and they'll be able to put together, I think, an extremely damning argument for the judge and, frankly, for the public about abuse of the process. Am I off base on that, or do you think that there's a lot to be discovered?
No, I think that's absolutely right. The fact that none of the lawyers in the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Eastern District of Virginia would agree to even sign on to participate in the prosecution. You got lawyers, well, I guess one is from the Eastern District of North Carolina. You had to bring in a new U.S. attorney who's never been a prosecutor to sign the indictment. The fact that these career folks in one of the premier offices in the U.S. attorney community.
Talk a little bit about that office and why it's a premier office.
Right. It's one of the offices that you go to when you have these very sensitive national security cases. Its proximity to Washington means that it potentially has public corruption matters that deal with federal officials. It is a really vital office, staffed by really great people.
And lots of them.
Lots of them. Substantial numbers of them whom have been removed, substantial numbers of whom have resigned, including the Trump-appointed U.S. attorney who simply wouldn't do Trump's bidding when it came to this Jim Comey indictment. He said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to resign rather than put at risk, potential bar consequences. And that's how I think some of these lawyers need to think about. You do all of these things at the direction of the president, there's going to be an end to this administration. And then I bet you're going to see bar associations looking at the conduct of these people in the same way that they looked at and ultimately disbarred Rudy Giuliani. So folks need to keep that in mind as they are doing things that they think will please this president.
And they also seem to be forgetting that there are judges looking at them and witnessing this aberrant behavior. And to the extent that a judge makes decisions along the way that involve, the benefit of the doubt or having confidence in an attorney's representations, or like where you can move things more rapidly and where you really want to dig in and go step by step to make sure the government is doing every step by the numbers, it doesn't do any good to have the local federal courts witness things like the rush to bring the indictment in, the U.S. attorney not knowing which courtroom to go to, the U.S. attorney presenting two mismatched indictment returns to the court at the same time. I mean, it looks like the Gong Show, and judges think of that. Boasberg is the very respected chief judge of the District Court of the District of Columbia, very senior federal judge. The FBI chief, Kash Patel, testified in the Judiciary Committee that he was under order not to discuss his grand jury testimony in the Mar-a-Lago case from the Chief Judge Boasberg. He didn't mention his name, but he mentioned his office. Well, turns out that wasn't true. So now you have the head of the FBI, the district court in the District of Columbia probably does more FBI business than anywhere because they do all the local crimes as well in the district. And you've now educated the chief judge of that district court that the FBI director lies about stuff. I mean, doesn't that have – think back to your time on the federal bench. What kind of consequences would that have when you see these antics happening with lawyers in front of you?
I mean, that has an enormous negative impact on the Justice Department. If the Justice Department is not seen as a credible player by judges, that has all kinds of negative consequences where you don't have, a judge doesn't have the ability to believe that a representation made by, and this is a pretty amazing statement, a representative of the United States government is in fact accurate or truthful. And then beyond that, given all that they have been doing and the publicity that that has generated, what about the citizens in the District of Columbia, the Eastern District of Virginia? What are they going to think about representatives of the United States who come in and have cases that they want them to believe that the government is accurate in its presentation about? So it impacts not only judges, but also people who will serve in juries. There's going to have to be a lot of damage repair at the conclusion of this administration with regard to, among other places, the United States Department of Justice.
And it's not just the FBI director lying about a particular court order. We are seeing federal judges across the country appointed by every president have cases presented to them by Trump administration lawyers that they are blowing up with really harsh language, disingenuous arguments, unfounded statements, verging on contempt, potentially contemptuous, words like that. Tell me about your time as Attorney General, because I can tell you that when I was U.S. Attorney, if a Rhode Island district judge in our federal court had used that kind of language about one of my lawyers, we would have gone to DEFCON 1 to understand what the hell went wrong. Because that, for the reasons you just said, you have to have trust that the government attorneys are always telling you the truth, always, non-debatable. And when that doesn't happen, it's a big deal. So there would have been meetings. People have been called in. We'd have reviewed the attorney's conduct, what the hell went wrong in that courtroom. And here there are dozens and dozens of these deeply, deeply damning condemnations of the work product, shoddy, unacceptable from federal judges about the Department of Justice. How often did you see that when you were Attorney General? And if you were getting that, what would you have done about it?
Well, I didn't see it very often, if at all. And the reality is that you'd expect, good U.S. attorney like you to be probing to see what was going on with regard to why the judge said what he or she said. But beyond that, that would trigger, I would bet, an Office of Professional Responsibility, OPR, investigation to look at the conduct of the attorney involved to see if there is some reason to discipline that attorney. Justice Department takes very seriously its credibility and the obligations that it has in representing the people of this country before judges and before juries. And so, that'd be internal office looks at what happened, but also there is a part, as you know, of the Justice Department called the Office of Professional Responsibility that looks at precisely these matters and then makes findings and then reports these findings on a yearly basis.
Well, it seems that the United States Department of Justice, under this first MAGA Attorney General, now has an audience of one, and that audience of one inhabits the Oval Office. And the blowback as the judges realize that the traditional duties and honorable conduct of the Department of Justice no longer drive its conduct, I think it's going to be very significant and damaging to the department. Eric Holder, former Attorney General of the United States, friend, thank you so much for coming on this program, and we can talk some other time about OPR and what's not being investigated over there right now. But thank you for joining me. I'm very proud to know you.
Well, thanks for having me. You keep digging. You keep giving them hell.
Yes, sir.